Hello everyone, this is Steve Kress. I'm the director of Project Puffin and the Audubon Seabird Restoration Program. So it's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon to reflect back on what has been a most amazing summer for this project in its 45th year, and to answer some of your questions. So I've been really pleased with how many questions I've received. They're very interesting. Shows a lot of insight, and so we're going to just bring up those questions and I'll answer them as we go here. So here we go. I'll read the question first and then give you an answer. Where do the puffins, where do the pufflings go after they have fledged? Terrific question. I wish I could tell you, but I can give you some thoughts as to where they might go. The reason I can't tell you accurately is that we've yet to put any tracking devices on Maine puffling chicks. We do that just because we need to be able to retrieve the tracking devices that we have available that are the right size. And we never know when the puffins are going to come back and exactly where they're going to be, so our best information is actually about the adults, not about the chicks. That said, my hunch is that they probably start out immediately heading southward in the Gulf of Maine. The reason that I think that, and they may stay in the Gulf of Maine, the reason I think that is that years ago when we translocated so many puffin chicks, nearly 2,000, the only chicks that were ever recovered were a few that were found south of us. The currents in the Gulf of Maine flow to the south. And when chicks fledge, often their wings are not fully developed and they're probably not strong flyers. So I would guess soon after fledgling they stay in the Gulf of Maine heading south. They may, as their wings mature, they may do the same migration that the parents do, and that would take them up to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and after spending a month or two where the parents are, they would fly back, if they're doing the parent migration, back to the Gulf of Maine, perhaps wintering along the continental shelf. But that's a lot of speculation. It's going to be a while till we develop the kinds of equipment small enough to put a tracking device that would reach a satellite. Then we would be able to get better information on where the fledglings go after they leave the island. Do the pufflings ever fledge in daylight hours, especially if they have stayed in the burrow longer than usual? Well, I would hesitate to say they never fledge during daylight, because one thing that I've sort of come to realize is that as soon as you start generalizing, it never applies. So there's always exceptions. However, pufflings usually fledge at night. It's possible that one could fledge in the daytime. There's strong reasons why pufflings don't fledge in the daytime, and the main reason they don't is that they'd be much more vulnerable to gull predation. Herring gulls and great blackback gulls are quick-eyed predators, always looking for an opportunity to catch a meal. Small birds are one of their common prey, so pufflings leave at night. And it's interesting to think about how that came to be, because if the puffins fledged in the daytime, they were eaten by gulls, and so they didn't survive to reproduce fledglings that left in the daytime. So that daytime fledging is very unusual. That said, I have seen pufflings coming out in daytime, exercising their wings outside the burrow, because the burrow can be very cramped, and they don't want to abrade the wingtips by exercising inside too much, so they do come out to exercise, but they're near the burrow and they can dive back if threatened by a predator. So I think it'd be rare for one to fledge during the daytime. Certainly wouldn't be a good idea. If one were to ask me, I'd say probably don't do it. And I don't think that if the chicks have stayed in the burrow extra long, like some have this year, that would be any more reason that they would fledge in the daytime. So I wouldn't look for that. I'm moving on to another question. First two questioners pointed out how they admire the work of Project Puffin, and I really appreciate that. That means a lot to us. How many of the pufflings this year survived to fully fledge, and what caused some to be lost during August? Well, it's still too early to know how well they will do, but Keenan, who is following this closer than I, he and I were talking about this, and he thinks that if the remaining chicks all fledge, then maybe about half of the chicks this year will fledge. That's neither our best or our worst year. So that would be great news if that, in fact, is the way this season ends. So, and the other part of that question was, what caused some of the chicks to be lost during August? We did lose some of our chicks during August. They starved in the burrows. This has been a very warm year. By some estimates, it may be the second warmest on record. Our records don't show it quite that warm out at Seal Island and Matinicus Rock, but it certainly is among the warmer years for the sea surface temperature, especially when we get into July and August. And when we see warmer temperatures, that is not good news for the puffins because their food becomes less available. And so that's why we lost some of the chicks. There just was not enough food near enough for the adults to capture enough to feed both themselves and their chicks. They had to work too hard, they were away too long, and the chicks didn't make it. And partly that's because some of the foods they did bring back were inedible. So if they worked hard to capture a big butterfish, and the chick couldn't swallow it, that also contributed to the problem. I think we're going to probably get to this, but just as a bit of an overview, and I think I'll just expand on that question a little bit for those that have not followed this season so well. This has been a very unusual season for the food for the puffins on all three of our islands, but especially on Seal Island and Matinicus Rock. Over the years, we've seen that each island has its own characteristic food supply, and the diet varies from island to island, but sometimes even those islands, which are only about 10 miles apart, they actually this year both have faced a similar condition of not enough food. They both started out feeding their young almost entirely on haddock soon after the chicks hatched in early July, late June and early July. The primary diet was haddock, almost 100%, and the only other thing they were bringing back was squid, short-tailed squid. And but mostly it was haddock, very young haddock, and the haddock were not fully developed, and it took a lot of them, but there apparently was a lot of haddock. Haddock is one of the recovering fish stocks on our coast, and so that was good news. It shows that good fisheries management is helping the fishing population and the seabirds. And I was hoping that haddock would hold out if it was the primary food. It did not, however, and other foods that puffins typically eat, like hake and sand lance, were not showing up either. And herring, which is perhaps the best food of all, was essentially absent in the puffin chick diet. Then in mid-July, the haddock disappeared, almost essentially. And the only thing the puffins were bringing back was a bit of haddock, some hake, and then butterfish started to show up. Butterfish is a warmer water fish that in some warm years, not always, but in some warm years, the butterfish starts showing up and the puffins bring it back. If they bring it back too early in the season and the butterfish is on the large size, that is sometimes almost twice as long as their beak length, then the puffin's chicks can't swallow it. It's just too big and too round, and they try, but they just can't swallow it. And that's the way this season was going, and that's when some puffin chicks died. And now, but happily, in the second week of August, we started seeing the puffins, surprisingly, all of a sudden, started finding food. We have since looked at the sea surface temperatures, and during part of that time, the sea surface temperature actually dropped a little bit, and that may have something to do with it. But I would emphasize that these relationships between food and water and sea surface temperatures, we're still figuring this out. There's a lot of factors going on, and the ocean is not a uniform place. So where the fish are and what the water temperature is, those are local conditions that can affect the outcomes and affect whether puffins are able to find enough food close to the island. But the exciting thing about this summer, the big surprise, was that food became very abundant all of a sudden. And there were some burrows, the one where Puffling Grace lives, those Grace's parents were able to bring back, I think our record was 19 feedings in one day. Thank you very much to the cam watchers who helped provide that interesting bit of data. But that was happening in all the other burrows, and puffin chicks, those that survived that very difficult period in late July and early August, have now been putting on weight. I'm going to go back to my questions here because I could just go on and on about this. It's so interesting. Yeah. All right. I'm going to move on to the next question. Do all the puffins that were fledged on Seal Island return, or will they end up going to other puffin areas? And can the age of a mate vary by a year or two, or are the mates always from the same fledge year? Whoa. Okay, lots of questions there. So I used to think that pufflings that headed to sea would remember their home nesting island and return there. Project Puffin was sort of based on that idea, that if you moved puffin chicks to a new location, they would learn the fledging location, they'd come back and breed. It's turned out that it's not that straightforward. Some do that, and they never visit any other islands. But we now know that when puffins they spend their first 2 years floating out on the ocean. We don't know where they go in those years. But when they come back at age 2, they will usually visit several nearby islands. And we can see the same bird on several islands in the same day. These are the 2-year-olds. And they spend time doing what is called prospecting. They're looking for a future home. And so they will spend a little time on one island, then move to another island, and then to another island. Others will just come back and they will return, as far as we know, only to their what's called the natal island, the island they hatched at. And then they generally keep that up for several years, breeding for the first time when they're 5 years old. We have a few records of breeders at 4. That's unusual. More often 5, 6, or 7 years old, breeding for the first time. But by the time they're 7, or 6, they have picked out a burrow, and they've been defending it maybe for a better part of the season. ahead of time. Their mate may be the same age, or it may not be. I don't think age has a lot to do with mate selection in puffins. They seem to have other things they're looking for. Older males or older females may well pick a young mate. And so they don't always come back and pair up with a chick from the same year. That was happening more commonly in the beginning years of Project Puffin, when we were releasing lots of birds and they were all coming back about the same age. But the age of the mates doesn't seem to be predictable, and that's interesting. Exactly how birds determine their future mate is also an interesting question. Clearly, it has something to do with the colors of the beak, colors that we probably can't even perceive, because we know now that puffins can see in the ultraviolet spectrum. There's been some recent work showing that puffin beaks actually give off ultraviolet spectrum color, and so that means that puffins can see in that spectrum, as can many kinds of birds, and that's probably something that can be useful. But is the information that the female uses in picking a mate, is it adaptive, or do they just like the color and the beauty of a colorful big beak? It is true that beaks of puffins get bigger and more ornate with age. And so, in theory, a female it's always the female that picks the male initially, but the male may also be preferring certain females. When you see bright color similar in male and female, that suggests there may be some selection going in both directions. But if the female is making initial selection, she could know by looking at the male's beak whether it's got multiple ridges and grooves on it, or whether it's a more simple beak, and make some choices based on the size and the ornateness of the beak, and maybe colors as well. See how far I drifted from the question on that one. I think I got that one. Plus. So here's another question. How do puffins claim a burrow? I understand there have been 2 sets of parents in number burrow 59. Is it first come, first serve? With the intruders this year, there was some speculation the puffins might have been looking for a burrow for next year, so was not understanding how they could claim it a year in advance. What is considered a claim? So puffins, male and female, typically return to the same burrow year after year, and that makes a lot of sense if you think about the burrow. If it was a place where they bred successfully the year before, then that burrow was a good burrow, and rather than claim another burrow, go back to where you bred the year before. To keep a claim on a burrow, the puffin parents have to be back early in the year and have to get back in that burrow to make sure the burrow isn't taken over. But most of the returning puffins are doing the same thing. So when the whole colony we have about 500 pairs now at Seal Island, when those 500 pairs come back, if the male and female have survived, they will re-meet at the burrow where they bred the year before. Possibly they'll meet on the rocks above, or maybe even the water around, but it's likely that they're going to reuse that burrow year after year. And by being in the burrow, they are also defending the burrow. The Burrow Cam has showed us some real insight as to how this works, because we've seen what some of these prospectors, which are younger puffins, they're in the 2, 3, and 4-year-old age range, looking for a future home, and they've popped their head inside of an active burrow. We've seen this at burrow 59. puffins come in and they are attacked by the parents if they are in the burrow. If they're not in the burrow, as sometimes happens when when they may be out fishing, then the intruder can start feeling at home and may take over the burrow, or in some cases attack the chick. The chick is not going to be able to defend the burrow, and we saw that with Grace this summer. It was a very interesting opportunity to see in a summer where food was not so abundant. The parents were away more. They were looking for food, probably traveling further away to find food, and they left their burrow unprotected. And these prospectors, who didn't have a chick to tend or a burrow, but were looking for a future home, were popping into burrows, and they popped into burrow 59, and without an adult there, they got into some mischief with Puffin chick Grace, and there was a couple squabbles and pecks. It was interesting to see that. I had not seen that before. They didn't seem to have particular ill intent, at least they didn't hurt Grace or try and chase Grace out of the burrow actively, and they eventually left. They were probably visiting many burrows. But if that kind of thing had continued, and Willie and Billy, the parents, had not been back at the burrow to defend it, it's likely they could lose it. Now, we've seen 2 pairs in the burrow over time, and one of those, and that change of parents may have been because the pair did not both come back. At least one of those parents is nesting nearby in a nearby burrow. So maybe one might guess they got back, the mate wasn't there, they weren't able to defend the old burrow, the survivor wasn't able to defend the old burrow, and a new pair moved in. That would seem to fit at least what we've seen. So puffins do claim their burrow a year in advance, and we've also seen them build a nest a year in advance, but they don't lay the egg a year in advance. That prospecting, that burrow defense, that nest building behavior is all sort of part of the puffin honeymoon, if you will, the engagement period, where the pair are getting to know each other. They are starting to do some housekeeping and defending the burrow, but because the breeding season takes so long, 3 months from the time the egg is laid to the normal fledging, and maybe longer, as in a year like this year, they can't prospect and lay an egg. It would all happen too late. So that's why they're in there ahead of time, a year ahead. Puffins are long-lived birds. They can live to be over 30 years old, so they have time to figure all this out. And once they pick a burrow on an island, the burrow may move around as opportunity dictates, but in Maine at least, there's no records of puffins moving to a different island. They will move somewhere else on the same island. There have been a few cases in Europe where puffins have moved to a different island, but that's usually followed some sort of a landslide or a major loss of habitat. And it's rare there as well. Question is, what is the latest date the puffins have been spotted on Seal Island? I can't give you the exact latest date, but I think into September. In previous years we've seen puffins there. I would guess we may set a record though this year because of the late nesting season and the extended chick rearing period. Keenan and Isabel and other researchers working on the project will be out there until September, mid-September, so we may hear more about that this year. Here's a question. Somebody says, my mom wants to know if puffins ever visit dry land other than mating season, and if so, where? Well, puffins don't come to land except to nest. And that's why they spend, or to think about nesting, or to get ready to nest. And that's why we don't see puffins older than or younger than 2 years on land. Occasionally it happens, but it's all about nesting. And once they leave the island, and this is one of the things that amazes people the most, once they leave the island, they sit on the water, and they spend most of their time just floating at sea. But remember that the sea is not a uniform place. It's as variable as is land. They're going to specific places at sea where they can reliably count on finding good feeding areas. These places at sea are just as important as the places on land, and we're just now beginning to figure out where those places are. Imagine, though, a bird just floating for a year just on the water, 2 years in the way of puffins, and then finally coming to land. It must feel so strange to put your feet on land after being floating at sea for 2 years. Floating, getting wet? No, they don't get wet at all. The water just the sea just sort of washes right over their feathers. Their feathers are perfectly waterproofed. Puffins can drink salt water. They can extract the salty brine. It dribbles out of their nostrils, and they can get all the water they need from drinking salt water, and they just have to dive under the water at these important areas and capture little fish, maybe even plankton. We don't know a whole lot about exactly what puffins are eating at sea. We know a lot more about it, what they're feeding their chicks. But at sea, we can imagine they'll eat a wide range of small prey. Here's a question. Will Gracie see her parents again? I'm pleased that you're enjoying Project Puffin and the Puffins. Will Gracie see her parents again? We sure hope so. But where will she see them? She might see them at sea, and she might come back and nest in a rock crevice just a few feet away from where her parents nest. That's something we have seen young puffins come back and nest near their parents. If the burrow happened to be vacant, maybe they wouldn't even use the same burrow where they hatched. I'm wondering what keeps Gracie from fledging. Is it the fuzz she still has around her head or body weight? So the down or fuzz on the chicks is an indication of age, but it's not going to keep a chick from fledging that is otherwise perfectly ready to fledge. A little bit of down still attached to the feathers is not a reason to stay. It is important that the feathers be fully developed to be fully waterproof. They have to be fully grown out, the body feathers themselves. Otherwise, the waterproofing, the critical waterproofing, won't be there. What determines whether a chick leaves? Well, if a chick leaves when it's not heavy enough and it heads off to sea, and they always head off without their parents. That's just the puffin way. I think that has, my hunch is that has come to be because the parents have to stay back at the burrow to defend the burrow from prospectors. And so one or both parents stay back at the burrow. The burrow is a precious resource, a precious place. Home is important to all animals, and puffins are especially need to keep that burrow. So that, usually what we see is the parents will stay longer than the chick. The chick leaves when it is ready, and this is but ready means that it has to, body weight has to be up to a certain amount. Otherwise, when they head off to sea on their own, they will have no reserves to bide them through until they start capturing their own food. If they happen to head off to sea when there's not much food out, as it was earlier in the year, that's not a good thing. The chicks probably wouldn't be able to capture enough food on their own to maintain themselves. So having a body weight is like, you know, a little backpack, heading off ready with some snacks on board that they can consume while they're learning to get better and better to feed. This is an amazing thing when you think about it. The chick, who has been a totally dependent animal, underground, living underground like a groundhog under in a hole. All of a sudden, it comes out at night, not a time when puffins normally they're not night animals. It comes out at night, and it knows instinctively what to do: to head to the horizon, to head away from land. Puffins don't swim toward the mainland. They swim toward the open sea. That distinction between dark and bright sky probably is very important. If it's interrupted by any landforms, they instinctively steer away from that. They know that land is their enemy. They are seabirds, and they need to get away from the island as fast as possible because there's only danger near land. They are much safer out on the open sea. And that's so that's so surprising to what we think of them, because we see them on land as a land animal, but no, think of them as a seabird, and this is just gives me more reason to admire them. So there little Gracie's going to head out to sea with her food supply built in. Hopefully she'll leave at the right weight. And isn't it amazing? They know enough not to leave when they're underweight. She stays in the burrow, and if she had left early, she would have probably starved at sea. And some of the other puffins starved in the burrow because they were waiting, hoping that the food would change. This was the big thing this summer to me. After 45 years, there's always new lessons. I learned this summer that the extended burrow period that puffins can do in the security of their burrow, it's worth the gamble for the chick and for the adults to keep feeding. And so this year, those that got through that hard time of only 1 to 3 feedings per day, that's not enough to keep the puffin chick healthy. They were rewarded by the return of the food. Maybe it was a slight cooling of the water, and the fish moved closer to the surface, and they became prey for the puffin chicks. This is what we think probably happened, or there was an influx of new food into the neighboring areas. We know puffins can fly up to about 20 miles from the nesting islands and back, so they're flying maybe 40 miles round trip for each of those beak loads of food. So something changed. Food became available again, and this extended life opportunity was a new life for the chicks that got through that period. Grace was among those, and she's developing quite nicely now, as are most of the other chicks. 7 of them left just a couple of nights ago. There's still about 13 chicks in our productivity study out of about 60 still on the island, which is very late. Here we are almost in September with puffins still feeding chicks. All right. I think I answered that question about the down. I did notice people commenting, thinking the parents needed to pull that down off of the chicks, preen it off, and then the chick will be ready to go. No, the down comes off naturally. The down just means that the bird isn't usually old enough, or it means that it hasn't exercising enough. As the chick gets really eager to go, as Gracie's doing, the chick will exercise and rub against the burrow. Some burrows are tighter, the down comes off faster. It's all about exercise and getting ready to go. Do the mosquitoes pose a health risk? I don't think so. Not on Egg Rock or Seal Island, not in our Maine islands. But mosquitoes are a problem. They do carry diseases in other places for birds, especially introduced mosquitoes, some land birds, a lot of problems with introduced diseases like avian malaria into land birds in Hawaii. I know that's been a big problem with mosquitoes, but I don't think it's a problem. None of the invertebrates in the burrow that we see there are a problem. You may have wondered what those animals are in the burrows. There's a cricket called the camel cricket. It's just a plant eater that crawls around in there, cleans up plant matter in the burrow. There's also a little crustacean called an isopod. It's a little flattened invertebrate that crawls around. Likewise, it's just eating organic matter. It's no problem for the chicks. Probably helps clean up the burrow a bit. So we have a question about what problems in the diet and are there deficiencies of the correct food. Well, puffins can eat a wide range of food. Some of it's higher in fat content than others. Those are, we think, the better food. But even those fish that are of lower fat content, probably if the puffins get enough of them, they'll be okay on that as well. So I wouldn't think, as long as the chicks can swallow it, it's probably all of it is enough. It's a question of enough calories of food for the chick to grow up to fledgling weight. We like to see chicks well into the 300 grams, and we weren't seeing that earlier in the year near fledgling. And we've got at least one chick on seal over 400 this year. That's a fat chick, very, very fat chick, probably a big male. The males tend to be a little heavier than the females, but anything in the mid 300s certainly is normal, especially for a female puffin. So Gracie is about right where she needs to be, so I would guess she's going to be fledging soon based on her plumage and her body weight. Question is, when the puffin fledglings go out to sea, do they hang around until they find other fledglings? Do they mix with adults and fledglings, or do they go alone at a great distance from other birds, minding their own business? Aren't seabirds usually in groups? So I wouldn't generalize about seabirds. It's a very diverse group, and there's a wide range of habits here. Some birds, like terns, the chicks fledge with the parents, especially the male parent tern will migrate and show the chick the migration route. Little razorbills and common murres, the chick heads off with dad. The mother stays back to defend the burrow or the nest site where the egg was laid. So every species has its own way. The puffin's way is for the chick to head off to sea. They're not the only ones that do that. Gannets do that. Other boobies do that. Some other ouses do that. Black guillemots do that. Usually burrow nesting birds have the luxury of staying in a burrow longer than do surface nesting birds. Predation is not as big of a problem if you live underground. But that underground spot is precious territory, so the parents generally have to stay back and protect it. So yes, seabirds are often in groups, and puffins likely too, though we don't know very much about grouping of puffins. They don't live in big rafts over the winter. They're out there in loose rafts near each other. There's probably safety being around other puffins at sea. Many eyes looking out for predators. There's still predators to watch for no matter wherever you are. Do you keep any statistics of the puffins that fledge and return every year? Are you seeing some sort of trend there? Great question. Yes, we do keep track of the puffins that fledge. The research assistants that live on the island spend much of their time out there with spotting scopes, reading leg bands on puffins. All that is entered into a database, and we get patterns. We get one of the things that we learn from this is how many puffins are coming back in a particular year. We have related this successfully to fledging weights. So this is how we know that chicks that are underweight when they head to sea are not as likely to come back as chicks that are heavy when they leave. And it's I think just a practical thing that a chick that's heavier it has more time to get to a place and more chance to find food since it's not being fed by its parents. And the return rate has been declining slowly over years. The early 1990s was really good survival. There must have been a huge amount of food, or the chicks were heavier, and that's our data suggests that, where we were seeing over 80% of the chicks surviving up to 2 years or more, and some years over 90% of the chicks that fledged had survived to at least 2 years. That's extraordinarily high among birds. Most little birds perish once they leave the nest. Doesn't matter what kind of bird. But puffins are great survivors at sea. And if they get away from land, as their instinct tells them to do, they have relatively few predators, and if they have good food supplies, if the oceans are rich with food, they have a good chance of surviving at sea. Let's see what else we've got. These are terrific questions. Thank you for thinking about this. So that's the trend we're seeing. Heavier puffins have a better chance of surviving, and a slowly declining return rate, though the return rate is still at about 50% on average in most years, which is still good. That still means the puffin populations have a chance to increase, and we are seeing the number of pairs increasing, even though the proportion of young surviving is declining. Do you know what caused the increment in food availability in August? I think we've talked about that. We think food became scarce as ocean sea surface temperature began to increase in mid-July. It definitely increased in mid-July, and the food became less available. Maybe it was diving deeper, where the fish can get cooler by diving deeper, or it moved too far away. This may have been a response to movements of plankton, who is also sensitive to warming sea surface temperatures. Warm water holds less oxygen, and that's not as good a habitat for the plankton or the small fish. So, I have your wonderful book. I want to thank you for bringing Puffins back. Thank you. Pleased that you've got it and that you're finding it informative. I have noticed that Willie and Billy have not stayed with Grace as much this season as in the past. She's been alone so much of the time. Has that been a setback to Grace? I know the shortage of fish has been a problem this season. That's absolutely true. I think we have seen less time for the parents in the burrow. I don't think it's a big problem for Grace, actually, not having the parents. She was able to thermoregulate, that is, maintain a body temperature after about her first week of life. But we also know that when the parents are there, they're doing two things. They are defending the burrow from intruders. So she was attacked a couple times. Didn't get hurt, but the parents, if they'd been there, they would have dealt with that quickly. We know they would have attacked the intruders and chased them off. So in that way, she missed them for sure. And of course, she also got a lot of comfort and preening. She missed a lot of comfort and preening. So hopefully, none of that will be a problem for her. We don't know the subtle effects of that. We do know that stress from loss of food can affect development. So we're hoping that she's okay on all fronts. How do you all know what happens after the puffins return to the sea? How generally do experts in your field track puffins when they're no longer on land? So we track puffins so far. The only way we've tracked them is to put little devices called geolocators on their leg band, little tiny boxes. They don't weigh any more than like a dime, but and so they don't really encumber the bird at all, and they behave normally. But we have to retrap the bird and take off the device in order to learn where the puffins go. Someday they will probably develop a satellite transmitter that'll be small enough we can attach the transmitter to beam up to a satellite, and that'll be real-time download. Those devices have been used on birds the puffin size. The problem is that puffins dive under the water, so you have to put waterproofing over that, and that makes these things big and bulky, and puffins don't like big and bulky things attached to their feathers. But I am hopeful that we are getting very close to developing devices that we can attach to puffins without encumbering them. It's already a hard enough life for them to go off to sea to capture little fish. So we're not going to put anything on them that we're not confident that they can handle with ease. But learning where puffins go for food is very key, and it's one of high on our list of research questions to obtain, to learn where puffins go so that we can begin to try to protect those spots and work toward creating marine protected areas where the puffins can go and find the foods they need. We have no idea exactly where they're going at this point. And likewise, where they go in the winter, and more specifically. Right now, we have general ideas within, maybe 100 miles of where the puffin's at, but we don't know exactly. That's useful for large scale protection, but we need a much more precise satellite or GPS would be helpful. Once puffins fledge, do they have any puffins out there at sea to show them the ropes like guillemots have? Well, yes, there are other puffins out there at sea, and I think instinctively they probably figure out where to go. Puffins are very good at spotting other puffins, so if they see another puffin on the water, they would probably spend time with those other puffins, and they're smart. I would guess they learn some things from the other puffins, but they also have a lot of built-in instinct. Their ability to dive, to get away from predators, to leave at night, all are pretty well hardwired. Guillemots, I think young black guillemots head off to sea with each other. Sometimes in Europe, the common murres are called guillemots. Young guillemots do head to sea with their father, and they leave at a young age, and he takes them to some place that he will be able to feed the chick at sea. It's a whole different strategy. So in Europe, guillemots are called murres, and that's how murres behave. I've read many comments about the gulls and whether or not they will actually prey on the pufflings, or if they are just there to see if there are any fish leftovers available once the pufflings have fledged. Everyone seems to have a different opinion. Can you tell us whether or not the gulls pose an actual danger to the pufflings? Thank you to you and Keenan and everyone who cares about puffins. And thank you for caring about puffins too. The question about gulls are opportunistic birds. Some of them will scavenge on leftover foods. Others will eat other birds. And some will do whatever is put in front of them. So I think that if a puffling was smart, it would stay away from gulls. I would think they'd be better off reducing exposure to gulls. You never know. One time I was watching a razorbill escort its little chick to the sea. This was at Matinicus Rock. And there's still a YouTube clip on YouTube about this. But the razorbill father was escorting his chick to sea, and he was leading this little chick over the sea. The chick was having a hard time getting up and down the rocks, but the father was intent on getting this chick to the sea. It was in broad daylight, which surprised me. And he was the father razorbill was walking right toward a group of great black-backed gulls and leading the chick right toward these gulls. And I thought, oh man, this is not going to end well. And whether that razorbill could tell by the body language of those gulls or whether it was just good luck, those gulls were not at all interested in that little razorbill. Wouldn't just been an easy bite for them if they had tried. And blackbacks especially can be bird predators, so you never know. And it had a happy ending. The male swam off with a little chick, and the blackback just took a nap. But in general, I think it's a good idea to steer clear of gulls. They can be predators. I know some have been seen on the rocks outside the Puffin burrows. That's the beginning of a long series of risks, and that's why Puffin chicks instinctively know to get on the water and to paddle off. You rarely see a fledgling around the island during the next day. By the next day, they are usually far from the islands, and their risk to gulls is less. How much longer until Gracie's face turns white? Oh, her face won't turn white until she's 2 years old. That next summer, her face will still be gray. The following year, she'll have a bright-colored beak, and her face will be, it won't be white. It's never, the face of a puffin chick is never as white as is the breast, but it'll be whiter than it is now. Could you please explain, after a fledge, how the puffins actually live at sea for the first 2 years of their lives? Well, we've talked about some of that in earlier answers. They're just very good at it, and everything's built in. They don't get wet, they drink salt water, they just dive under to catch their next meal. Still, think about it. Out there in the open ocean, the Gulf of Maine is a wild, wild place. Seas that can be 50 feet tall or more. And little puffin is just floating out there, bobbing along through all of this for years. Earlier this season, we had great concern about Grace's feeding, or rather what appeared to be lack of feedings. Is there a point when the researchers may deem intervention as best? So, our goal here is to learn about what's going on with the puffins as much as it is to help the puffins to fledge. We hope that we'll have enough good years of puffins fledging so this colony will continue to grow, but we know that puffin nesting success varies from year to year, and there will be years when chicks don't make it, and some of the chicks this year didn't make it. That's normal. They don't always survive. If we had intervened for Grace, which would not have been easy because she lives in a back far in a hole, we wouldn't have seen the amazing response of the parents of sticking with it. We would not have documented the recovery of both the chick and the food supply. And this is proving to be very, very good science because it's the only burrow that we have feeding rate data from this long. So Keen and I are now comparing feeding rate data with the changes in sea surface temperature and learning about how the parents are responding. We would not have had that picture if we had intervened. So it's hard because we care about every chick. We want every chick to survive, but most of the chicks we have no access to. They're under huge, deep boulders. We only have a few burrows where we can reach into. And so we are at this junction of trying to figure out how to manage the colony, hoping the colony grows. We do everything we can to prevent predation by chasing off gall predators, for example. But intervening through feedings is something we don't really have the capacity to do, or do I think would be helpful for the colony in general. We loved Gilly the Guillemot chick. I understand this was a first time banding. Well, 2019 have another Guillemot chick for observation. We should have another chick there because Guillemots, like Puffins, usually return to the same burrow, and maybe there'll be 2 chicks because they usually lay 2 eggs. So we'll keep the camera going there, learning about Guillemots as well as Puffin chicks. I had read that razorbills are somewhat reclusive, yet they were freely accepted and hanging out with Puffins on the loafing ledge. Any chance of observing them further? We've talked about maybe putting a cam in a razorbill nest, and that would be really interesting to see that. So far, we don't have a razorbill nest that has the right shape to accept a camera. Even most Puffin nests, we couldn't put the camera in. The camera that is necessary is large, and it takes a certain